You know, we talk a lot these days about revitalization and changing the community, you know, for the future. But I also thought that it was important, if we're going to be doing those things, to preserve some of the aspects of the community that not too many people, you know, remember.
The history of Westbury is important because it's unique. It's special. It's most Long Island history is not like Westbury. Westbury was founded in 1658, and it was a Quaker community. The ideals of the Quakers in Westbury have continued to this day, and it's still an unusual place on Long Island. Westbury, the Quakers in Westbury are part of the Underground Railroad. They created a community called Grantsville for freed slaves. And tell me another community around here that could say that.
It is one of the earliest integrated communities in Long Island. Partly, again, a large measure because of the Quakers. The Quakers had slaves, but they then manumitted them, freed them early on before the Revolution. And those slaves stayed local and then formed their own independent community that was attached to the Quaker community. So when the first schools were established in Westbury, from the very foundations of public schools in Westbury, the classes have been multiracial. And then it occurred to me when I was there that other villages around, notably Huntington, has all of these signs that indicate the various places in Huntington that are essentially related to the Revolutionary War. I thought that Westbury's history was just as interesting, and it just dawned on me, like, why don't we have such markers? Why shouldn't people know about this? As you're walking along the street, getting off the bus, parking your car, you ought to know this. So with that idea in mind, I just talked to Mayor Cavallaro, and I said, why don't we have such signs? And he says, that's a good idea. Why don't you head up a committee?
The Heritage Trail. What do a 17th century ship, a Quaker farmer, a descendant of slaves, a playboy with wealth almost beyond comprehension, and a grieving widow have in common with a sewing machine? Can a large retail nursery be inextricably intertwined with the Westbury monthly meeting of the Religious Society of Friends and the Westbury AME Zion Church? As incongruous as it may seem, the answers to both questions are yes. Each of these people, places, and things played an important role in the development of the history of the village of Westbury, as was recognized on a beautiful Saturday morning in September 2016. That day was the culmination of months of collaboration between the members of the Village Historic Landmark Preservation Committee, the Historical Society of the Westburys, and the Village Department of Public Works. A group of very dedicated people brought their common goal to fruition as they traveled the corners of the village, unveiling markers designating 6 disparate locations as historic sites and as part of its heritage trail.
The mayor decided to start a new initiative around understanding the history in a different way and putting up markers so that people become more conscious of the history of Westbury's village.
There was a new committee that was formed to try to be more specific about some of the historical sites in Westbury. So I took on that task of doing a little bit of research and then recommending to the mayor where we might be able to put up some historical placards that would indicate some of those significant places.
There's a member of the Westbury Historical Society on the commission, and he made his contribution and constantly was drawing on material from the Westbury Historical Society to aid the members on the history of different places in Westbury. We understood the history of Westbury. We identified places that have been known to be historic places. We had in-depth discussions about these places, and we vetted the information because with any historic place, there are different perspectives on that particular place. So we had to look at places that we felt had a very sound, solid set of facts behind its significance, so that there wouldn't be any question as to its historic importance.
So with the collective wisdom of the input of the committee, I think that we've really come up with really interesting sites. I'm convinced that what we have is as accurate as an historian can make it on the site.
You know, Westbury has a tremendous history, a long history, going back to the 1600s. So even though I grew up here, I wasn't always aware of all the different aspects of Westbury's history. You know, I obviously knew some aspects of the history, but through this process of trying to designate these historical markers that we engaged on last year, I learned a lot that I didn't know. And there's still, as every time we meet about these things and we talk about different locations, I learn new things. So even as somebody who's been a lifelong resident, I'm always learning something new about, you know, where Westbury came from, and that'll hopefully help us figure out where we want to go with it.
The process had begun months before, when the Village Historic Landmark Preservation Committee of 7 began its initial work in creating a village heritage trail.
The mayor says that we can produce them ourselves here in the village. The garage has the capacity to do this, so we did it.
We had a couple of samples that the village created. I think the first one was green with yellow writing, and one was actually the original was they were thinking about having the same color as the state signs, the blue and golds, but they decided to have something different. So we used the colors of Westbury colors, which is green and yellow, and they thought that the yellow would stand out more than the green. The green would probably blend in with the trees in the background. So that was the reason for the colors.
First, there was the planning, the designing, the crafting, the installation, and finally, on September 17, 2016, the first 6 signs were presented to the public.
There's a lot of criteria for what makes something significant for designation. The age, the big part of it, longevity of something, what kind of an impact something had on the village, something that's like a clear landmark that everybody recognizes, things like that.
Any marker that is put up in the village has to be vetted. It has to be, we have to discuss and understand that history enough to feel that there was a solid set of data to support it.
In my mind, the most important thing is just undertaking the effort to preserve some of the history of Westbury, not necessarily the individual sites. But once we had our first couple of meetings with the Preservation Committee, they came up with probably 12.5 sites that were under consideration. And we felt that 5 or 6 initial designations was probably appropriate for the first set of markers that we wanted to put up. But there were other locations that I would not have thought of, and maybe most people in Westbury wouldn't have thought of. And that was really why the process was interesting and important, because we did come up with some sites that wouldn't have been the logical ones at first blush.
Everybody just wanted to get this done, get it done right, and I think that we've accomplished that.
Now, about that sewing machine. The House of Ambrose Clark. In 1903, Frederick Ambrose Clark built a house on Post Avenue and what became known as Clark Street, what today we know as Rockland Street. Ambrose was the grandson of Edward Cabot Clark, a patent attorney and businessman who, with Isaac Merritt Singer, had founded the Singer Sewing Machine Company in 1851. The Singer sewing machine was the first that could be of practical use for the general public, and as the company became an international success, Edward Cabot Clark's wealth grew. He was a noted real estate developer, building before his death the Dakota on Central Park West in Manhattan. He amassed a fortune that permitted his grandson Ambrose to forego the drudgery of having to spend his life working. Instead, Ambrose Clark became, it was said, the quintessential equestrian sportsman of his generation. He owned, bred, raced, and rode horses until shortly before his death in 1964. He was famous for dressing in tweed cap, waistcoat, breeches, and tall boots, as he was portrayed in a 1904 portrait by Robert Henri, which is displayed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Clark was known to ride through Westbury in his coach and four and had stables with 32 stalls, a carriage room, a windmill, and a tack room on his Post Avenue property. This photograph shows the stables and tack room, but was taken after Clark had already sold the property. Clark himself had a lifelong dislike of automobiles, later banning them from the Meadowbrook hunt he held on his estate, Broad Hollow. In 1909, Clark sold the house and property on Post Avenue to Harold White and his family. The Whites had no such aversion to automobiles. The house and property were home to the Whites and their 4 sons and their 2 daughters. In the 1920s, the stable, the windmill, and the carriage house were destroyed by fire, leaving only the house and the tack room. The last member of the family living on the property left in 1932. Subsequently, for several years during the 1930s, the house became a branch of Saks Fifth Avenue. And then William Donahue leased the house for his funeral parlor in 1938. His business remained there until 1947, when he moved to Castle Avenue. In 1946, members of the Kiwanis Club led community support to purchase the property and to create the Westbury War Memorial Community Center. Thus began the repurposing of property and structure from private to public use. In 1947, on Memorial Day, the building was dedicated. Plans were created to make the property a worthy and useful memorial to all who served. It was intended to be for all people of Westbury, Old Westbury, Newcastle, and Carr Place. The initial plan was to use the property to provide the community with a library and a gymnasium, combined with a meeting hall complete with a stage. It was to serve as the true center of the community, providing sports, recreation, and a space for meetings and entertainment. The former house was remodeled to be used as a library, and the Westbury Neighborhood Association, which had served as the home of the Mary L. Post Library, assisted in the preparation of its relocation to the renovated center. The library opened on June 2, 1947, with Mary Granger as the librarian. When it initially began operation, the center was a corporation supported from contributions and revenue from fees. The library survived on voluntary contributions until 1956, but as it grew in size, serving as the library for high school students and adults, it became necessary to obtain financial support through taxation as part of the Westbury School District. After the plan was approved by the residents of Westbury, the Westbury Memorial Public Library was granted a charter by the Regents of the State of New York and opened in May 1956. At that time, it was open from 1 to 5 p.m. each day and from 7 to 9 p.m. 5 nights a week. By 1964, the building had become too small for the needs of the expanding library. The community voted to build a new library at its present location on Jefferson Street, where the library was moved in May 1966. Since the 1960s, the village of Westbury has made some additions to the Clark House and property. It is currently under the auspices of the Recreation Department. The principal user of the Clark House is the Senior Citizens Group, a large, lively, and ever-active organization. The remainder of the property provides the Recreation Department with the ability to offer a variety of services: a Little League field, a playground, and an athletic center. As well as community space for egg hunts, Memorial Day events, open-air concerts, holiday celebrations, and Santa Claus coming to town. The Westbury Monthly Meeting of the Religious Society of Friends. Once there was a well and a pump near the intersection of what is now Post Avenue and Jericho Turnpike, where travelers could get refreshment. Today, a rendering of that well and pump serves as the logo and symbol of the Historical Society of the Westburys. The site of the pump and the well is the home of one of the oldest continually occupied religious sites in this country, the Westbury Meeting of the Religious Society of Friends. In the late 1600s, bands of Quakers who had endured persecution in England sought religious freedom in the British colonies, sailing across the Atlantic Ocean and establishing settlements locally in Oyster Bay, Manhasset, and Jericho. In 1658, the Richard Stites family built a homestead near Captain Seaman, who had bought over 10,000 acres of land the year before in this area, which was originally called Wood Edge or Plain Edge, because the houses were built just north of an old Indian trail, today's Jericho Turnpike, where the woods met the open prairie, the then extensive Hempstead Plains. The Stites family farm was the only one in the area until Quaker Edmund Titus and his son Samuel joined them. Then Henry Willis, another English Quaker, settled in the area. Willis had emigrated from Westbury, England, and in 1663, after buying land in this area, he bestowed the name of his former hometown on this new community. Willis and Titus were joined by other Quakers seeking religious freedom, and they began to hold their religious services in their new community. The first meeting for worship, of which there is a written record, occurred in 1671. The meetings have been continuously held until today. Their religious services were called meetings because they were simple and without ritual. The meetings were held in the Quakers' homes, barns, or fields. By 1701, their numbers had grown so large, they decided to build a meeting house for their services. They chose the land at the present-day intersection of Post Avenue and Jericho Turnpike upon which to build it, and purchased 3 1/2 acres for the society. That meeting house, completed in 1702, was located on the southern side of the property. In 1776, as the United States was beginning its fight for independence from Great Britain, and 85 years before the start of the Civil War, the Friends of Westbury, compelled by their religious beliefs, joined with Quakers of Manhasset, Bethpage, Jericho, Locust Valley, and Wantaw as the congregations freed 154 slaves. They provided for the newly freed men and women until they could become established. and the free men, women, and children attended religious services and schools with the Quakers. The former slaves built homes near sheep grazing pastures, and they and their families worked mostly for farmers. Many of their children were apprenticed until they were 18 years old. Some started their own farms and dairies. In addition to their advanced views concerning the abolition of slavery, the Quakers were strong proponents of education for all. In 1781, they built a 40-foot by 20-foot school on land near the west side of Post Road, north of where the Westbury High School now stands. In 1800, the meeting house, which had been enlarged in 1722 and 1766, was deemed to be too small. The congregation determined that the 1702 meeting house should be torn down. A new one was built for $2,056.33, and it stood about 40 by 57 feet. Unrest was growing in the society, however, during the early part of the 19th century, as differences in philosophy caused a rift between those members, some of whom had a more liberal trend of thought than the more conservative members. Elias Hicks, one of the earliest abolitionists, was at the forefront of the controversy. Elias was a power behind the New York State Act of 1827, which outlawed slavery within the state and freed all slaves within its borders. His followers became known as Hicksites. In 1828, the two groups split. The group of more orthodox Quakers, who followed the preachings of George Fox, separated from the Hicksites. In 1830, the more conservative members built the Orthodox Meeting House, the gray structure that sits closest to Post Avenue. The second meeting house of 1801 burned down in 1900. In 1902, a third meeting house was built by the Society. It is still in use today, and after a reconciliation of the two factions, it became the site of the Society's organized services. The 1830 Orthodox Meeting House is used today as a school, and today provides educational opportunities for nursery, pre-kindergarten, and kindergarten-age children up to the second grade. The National Wildlife Federation has designated the school grounds as a schoolyard habitat, an outdoor classroom where teachers and students learn how to attract and support local wildlife. Also on the grounds at the southern portion of the property is a cemetery known for its beautiful trees and shrubs. Many are buried there in unmarked graves dating from the settlement of Westbury. The cemetery is in use to this day. The Westbury monthly meeting of the Religious Society of Friends still holds services at the third meeting house. The Nassau County Historical Society designated it as a landmark. It has been the site of fairs and farmers' markets and is a staple of village life. To this day, the Society offers Quaker worship each Sunday at 11 a.m. and holds Sunday school and educational programs for adults. Hicks Nurseries. On November 11, 1621, the ship Fortune set sail from England to Plymouth, Massachusetts. Aboard were a second group of Puritans following the Mayflower. Among them were Robert Hicks, a leather dresser from Suffolk, England. His wife Margaret and their children arrived from England in June 1622 aboard the ship Anne. The family settled in Duxbury, Massachusetts. Within 2 years, their sons, John and Stephen, left and went to New York, and by 1642, John and Stephen had acquired property and had settled on Long Island. John's son Thomas became a member of the Society of Friends. and it was his great-grandson, Elias, who became the abolitionist so much a part of the movement for the freeing of slaves, not only by the Quakers, but of all slave owners in New York. But we are concerned with the son of Elias's cousin Isaac, who was also named Isaac. This Isaac Hicks was born in 1815. He became a farmer and was active in the Westbury Monthly Meeting and Quaker organizations. In 1853, he decided to turn part of his gravel farmland into a nursery. He bought some apple trees from a nursery in Flushing, planted them, and before long was selling apple trees himself to local farmers as Isaac Hicks and Sons. He had 25 acres of land planted with fruit trees, berry bushes, Norway maple trees, and flowering shrubs. Isaac's sons were an integral part of his business. His son Edward studied at the Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute and later taught there. He invented and patented machinery that made it possible to remove large trees intact from the ground. When Garden City was founded in 1869, Edward's invention helped the nursery plant full-grown trees to landscape the new town. Another of Isaac's sons, Gilbert, who was deaf, set up a printing press in the attic of the family home. In the 1860s, Gilbert printed leaflets and catalogs to advertise the trees and shrubs the nursery could supply. Isaac's grandson and Edward's son Henry was born in 1870 into a simple farming life of milking, haying, and digging trees. He went to Cornell and graduated in 1890 from the College of Agriculture. It was under Henry's management that the business, now known as Hicks Nurseries, truly flourished. Wealthy industrialists and merchants were building unimaginable estates along the Gold Coast of Long Island, and Henry knew that these wealthy estate owners wanted instant landscaping. They could not, as one of the Hicks catalogs said, wait a lifetime to enjoy the benefits of a tree. Edward's machinery had been refined. Joseph Wicke, a longtime manager of the nurseries, had developed new techniques for moving trees. Henry's knowledge of horticulture allowed them to protect the roots of the trees during the transplanting process. And so, Hicks Nurseries became the specialist in supplying full-grown trees to customers. The nursery would move enormous trees standing up to 60 feet tall and weighing as much as 30 tons, and the nursery was capable of doing it all year round. Teams of horses would be used to haul trucks in which the trees would be loaded. Sometimes the trees would be transported on barges and floated around Long Island. Sometimes they'd be moved by rail. The trees went as locally as Old Westbury in Manhattan and as far away as the Henry Ford estate in Detroit, Michigan. This unique part of the business had the added benefit of changing the very nature of the company. Instead of being only a seasonal business, because the nursery was moving trees throughout the year, the nursery could afford to employ its crews, which consisted of Italian, Polish, and Swiss immigrants throughout the year. Their continuous employment engendered employee loyalty. At times, the Hicks employed entire families. For instance, 9 of Joseph Wicke's 10 sons worked for the nurseries. These long-time employees made an impact on the village, even supplying the names of some of its streets. For instance, Wicke Avenue was named for Joseph, and May Avenue was named for May Clinton, who worked as the company's bookkeeper for 60 years. The business expanded to almost 300 employees, and by 1943, the nursery had grown to 350 acres of property, and included a supply of choice trees and shrubs that had originated in Asia. Henry had become so respected in the horticultural business that the chief plant explorer for the United States Department of Agriculture, who roamed the world looking for new plants, would always send a sample of a new species to him. Through crossbreeding, Henry developed the Hicks yew, the basis for the ubiquitous evergreen hedge. He pioneered the idea of using a live tree at Christmas so that the tree could be planted after the holidays instead of just being discarded. He also acted as a consultant to Robert Moses on the planning of the parkways, suggesting a lane of greenery between the lanes of traffic on the Northern State Parkway. In addition, Henry Hicks was also a member of the Westbury School Board for nearly 30 years. He fought for higher education and the building of a high school in Westbury, as well as for the creation of junior colleges for extended education. Henry's sons Edwin and William guided the business through the Depression through innovative moves. William made pre-dug plants available for customers and ushered in the start of a retail garden center. Edwin's son Fred, also a graduate of Cornell University, realized when he took over the business that the model had to change yet again. He was surrounded by suburban homes, broken up estates, and homes where, because there were often 2 working members of the household, customers had less time for gardening and landscaping. Fred reduced the size of the nursery so that in 1996 it consisted of 36 acres. He introduced holiday-themed shows, which soon became family traditions, and subtly acquainted children with gardening at an early age. Because suburban homeowners, instead of farmers, sought the help of nursery employees, he began to offer seminars and demonstrations to the public. Today, trees are still for sale at Hicks Nurseries, along with pre-dug plants and all the tools and implements the casual home gardener needs. All that befits the ultimate 21st century upscale garden center is available for sale there today, as the 6th generation of Hicks manages the family business. The site of the Vanderbilt Cup Race grandstand. In October 1878, William Kissam Vanderbilt Jr. was born into an almost unimaginable life of wealth and privilege. He was raised in Vanderbilt mansions, traveled to Europe, and sailed the world in his family's yachts. He was a college dropout, leaving Harvard after 2 years, and he had a no-show job as a vice president of the New York Central Railroad. But he did have a specialty: sport. He was an accomplished sailor, he knew a lot about horses, and he was an expert automobile driver. Most importantly, he was addicted to speed. Supposedly, Willie K, as he was known, fell in love with speed after riding in a steam-powered tricycle in France in 1888. 10 years later, he owned a motorized tricycle, which he rode around Manhattan. Then he began to speed regularly in his automobiles between Manhattan and his parents' estate in Oakdale, Long Island. Known as a scorcher, Willie K outraged his neighbors and the police, who believed that the roads were for horses and pedestrians. In 1903, Willie K was participating in auto races in Europe, like the race from Paris to Madrid. In 1904, having acquired a Mercedes capable of reaching high speeds, he raced on the Daytona Beach road course, where he set a new land speed record of 92.30 miles per hour. Although he was only 26 in 1904, Willie K had his heart set on starting his very own race, the first international automobile race to be held in the United States. No newcomer to sponsoring races was he. He had been doing so for 10 years in Europe. This race, however, was going to be special. Willie K intended to give American manufacturers an incentive to create racing cars capable of competing with the advanced European models. And the race, the first of its kind in the United States, would start and finish on Jericho Turnpike in Westbury. His race would offer a generous cash prize to the winner in order to attract the world's best drivers and their cars. In addition, he would award the winner a sterling silver trophy crafted by Tiffany's, and the store would display the cup in its windows several weeks before the race. The Vanderbilt Cup is fittingly embossed with the figure of Willie Kay in the Mercedes, in which he had set the land speed record at Daytona. It cost $800 originally, and its base cost $13.80. These days, it is priceless and is part of the collection of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. The race course was to be 30.24 miles long, beginning on Jericho Turnpike in Westbury, to the Massapequa-Hicksville Road and the new Hempstead-Bethpage Turnpike, running clockwise. In 1906, as this map shows, the course was slightly shorter and the route began in the opposite direction. The race in 1904 was to be run mostly in Nassau County, but some of it was run in Queens. The route included 3 sharp turns at Jericho Turnpike, Plain Edge, and in Queens. But Willie Kay's plan was not without controversy. In fact, it was not easy to convince the people who lived along the route that this race was a worthwhile venture. After all, they asked, why should a son of the rich and famous be allowed to monopolize the use of their public roads for what was a dangerous hobby in which only an advantaged few could indulge? They doubted that their towns would benefit at all from this. Local officials, however, thought otherwise. They saw a lot of revenue pouring into the county along the race route. Only a few days before the race, the Nassau County Board of Supervisors and judges of Nassau County approved the running. Because the race was to run over railroad tracks in certain locations, to try to ensure public safety, the Long Island Railroad stopped trains during the actual running of the race and closed the use of the public roads. Willie Kay, at his own expense, had 90,000 gallons of oil placed on the course to hold down the dust on the dirt roads and make them faster. And some industrious local residents, seeing earning potential in all this hoopla, offered parking spots on their property to spectators for $25. Others sold sandwiches and coffee for a profit. Large crowds descended upon Westbury on Saturday, October 8, 1904. Most arrived from Manhattan at the Westbury train station by special trains for the event. The race started at dawn, and 18 cars participated. 5 were from the United States, the rest were from France, Italy, and Germany. By race time, approximately 2,500 people had gathered. They were in the wood grandstand that had been constructed on Jericho Turnpike along the portion that now lies between the property belonging to the Society of Friends and Powell's Lane. Many members of high society had come to watch, including Willie Kay's wife, the silver mining heiress, Virginia Fair Vanderbilt. It was said that she jumped up from her seat in the grandstand to wave at each car that drove past her. Also in the grandstands were American car manufacturers, the merely curious, and the entrepreneurs who were selling cigarettes. It is estimated that between 15,000 and 20,000 people gathered along the race's route to watch the sleek, innovative cars race past them at about an average of 80 miles per hour, an unthinkable rate of speed in that day. The spectators at the finish line were hopeful an American car would defeat the Europeans, but just short of 7 hours after the race began, George Heath, driving a French car, crossed the finish line and won the Vanderbilt Cup race. After Albert Clement finished second, fans streamed across Jericho Turnpike onto the course. In order to ensure their safety, the race had to be called. The race was held the following year, but the starting-finish line was moved to Mineola. In 1906, the start and finish line returned to Westbury on Jericho Turnpike. After skipping 1907, the race was held again in 1908. That year, part of the race was held on paved roads, and an American car driven by 23-year-old George Robertson from Garden City won the beautiful Vanderbilt Cup. The race would be held on Long Island at different locations until 1910. Subsequently, the race would be held in other states, and after 1916, be held only 3 more times, in 1936, 1937, and 1960. When the first race had been held in 1904 in Westbury, it had caused a sensation. It had led to the advancement of the American automobile and the construction of the Long Island Motor Parkway, which was part toll road, part race course, and the forerunner of the state parkway system, without which suburbia could not grow. Willie Kay, one of the most prominent and visible proponent of automobiles, was among the original movers of it all. Today, books like that written by Vanderbilt Cup expert Howard Kroplik, and a website and a blog about the races, as well as exhibits at the Suffolk County Vanderbilt Museum and the 2017 New York International Auto Show, keep the memory of the race alive. It all started in 1904, right here on Jericho Turnpike. Children's Library Robert Bacon Memorial. Martha Bacon's husband Robert died suddenly in May 1919 from a blood infection after ear surgery. He had survived being in France during World War I and had only returned to the United States the month before. It was an abrupt, unforeseen, and sad end to their 36-year marriage. In time, she decided that she wanted to create a memorial to him, and as a result, Martha Bacon endowed what is only one of 3 libraries in the world dedicated to children. Martha Waldron Cowden was born in New York City around 1860. Robert Bacon was born in Massachusetts that same year. In 1880, Robert Bacon graduated from Harvard University, where he had become friends with another student, Theodore Roosevelt. 3 years later, in 1883, Robert and Martha married. They would have 4 children. During their marriage, Robert Bacon became a partner with J.P. Morgan and Company, where he was involved in the formation of U.S. Steel Corporation. In 1905, President Roosevelt appointed Bacon to be Assistant Secretary of State, and in that capacity, he was essential in the passage of the treaties with Colombia and Panama by the United States Senate that permitted the building of the Panama Canal. Eventually, he served as the Secretary of State at the end of Roosevelt's term of office and was appointed the ambassador to France. The Bacons lived at the French embassy from 1909 to 1912. When Robert's appointment ended, he, Martha, and their daughter, Martha, were to return home on the Titanic. Because the arrival of the newly appointed ambassador was delayed, the family did not sail on the Titanic. Instead, they arrived safely home aboard another ship. In August 1914, just weeks after the war had broken out in Europe and France was being invaded, Robert Bacon returned to France to assist the American Field Service, which provided ambulances and drivers to support French and British forces. After the United States joined the war, he was commissioned as a major in the United States Army in May 1917 at the age of 57, and sailed to France as a member of General Pershing's staff. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in 1918. During the war, Martha helped organize and support the American Ambulance Corps in Paris, and she was awarded the French Legion of Honor for her work. After Colonel Bacon's death, Martha was unsure how to honor him. Should she endow a museum, a library? While contemplating what to do, she consulted with Anne Carroll Moore, who was the supervisor of work with children in the New York Public Library. Moore had done innovative work at the Pratt Institute years earlier, where she had organized a children's room. At a time when children were excluded from libraries until the age of 14, Carroll created a space at the Pratt Institute that welcomed young children. It contained furniture of their own size, had open stacks and reading nooks. Carroll held story times, puppet shows, and summer programming. She arranged for there to be plenty of books of quality and she staffed it with librarians who were dedicated to working with children. Moore had brought her groundbreaking ideas to the New York Public Library, and Martha Bacon sought her out. Martha Bacon decided that what she would do is she would build and endow a library specifically for children in her husband's memory. The Bacons had owned a home in Old Westbury called Old Acres, and she decided that property adjacent to the school in Westbury would be ideal for her project. She consulted with Julian Peabody, a noted Manhattan architect who had designed the Westbury High School. She wanted the library to resemble the library in Old Acres. She wanted it to be a home library, not a public library. There would be a main room that was of the same dimensions as the library at Old Acres. It would have deep window seats, and the ceiling would be vaulted and high to create a sense of space. Her husband had been particularly fond of the fireplace in the French embassy. The mantel had been inscribed with the words in French that translated to mean, "Seek the line of the beautiful." There would be a bust of her husband in the library, too, for everyone to know in whose memory the library was dedicated. There would be oak tables and chairs of the right size for children, and the books would be on shelves that were reachable to them. Martha Bacon was intimately involved with the planning of the library. 2 huge mural maps would be on either side of the inner entrance door. One would be a map of Long Island depicting native birds and flowers, and the other of New England and Long Island. Mrs. Bacon designed them, and then she commissioned artist Stuart Travis to paint them. Mrs. Bacon was involved in choosing the trees and the shrubs that would surround the library: dogwood trees, flowering bushes, daffodils, and crocuses. She included a small pond and a bird sanctuary. And on the top of the library, there was a white cupola with a weather vane, on which there was a family of 5 metal owls, an image that would become associated with the library. Mrs. Bacon and Miss Carroll began to search for the librarian to run the library. They found Jacqueline Overton, who agreed to come for 6 months. She stayed for over 25 years. The original collection numbered about 2,500 books, selected by Mrs. Bacon with Miss Carroll's assistance. Over the years, Miss Overton grew the collection to 7,000 books. Counted among those books were works of esteemed children's authors and illustrators of the day. The library opened on June 24, 1924. There was a story hour, and the children were free to explore the new library that was just for them. The library was free, and it was exclusively for children up to the age of 16 to 17 years old. The children who came were astounded by what they saw, and they were delighted. There were, however, rules to be obeyed. Miss Overton taught the children how to care for books. If they wrote or drew on a book, their library privileges were suspended, and it was in her discretion how long that suspension lasted. She also made the children wash their hands before touching the books. At first, the library was open for 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, and children up to the ages of 16 to 17 were allowed to be members. Miss Overton held story times twice a week and conducted a special one on Halloween. She would read ghost stories in the attic to about 60 children. The attic was decorated with jack-o'-lanterns, black cats, and witches on broomsticks. She also had productions like the one of Alice in Wonderland. In In addition to building and endowing the library, Martha Bacon continually contributed gifts to the library, creating a large and wondrous collection of books and artwork. Among her gifts were Audubon prints, birds carved by Elmer Crowell, sketches and letters by Beatrix Potter, prints by N.C. Wyeth, Arthur Rockham, Leslie Brooke, and Kate Greenaway. In addition, Mrs. Bacon and later her daughter, Martha Bacon Whitney, would give the library dolls, antique valentines, and postcards, and knights in shining armor. Visitors came from all over the world to see the cutting-edge library that Mrs. Bacon had built in her husband's memory. Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt, Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the architect who built the library, Julian Peabody, and Elizabeth Grimble, who was a theatrical producer who helped establish the Cherry Lane Theater, as well as Ruth Sawyer Durand, an award-winning children's author, and the Crown Princess Louise of Sweden. Martha Bacon died at her home in Old Westbury in November 1940 at the age of 80. Her daughter, Martha Bacon Whitney, carried on her mother's oversight of the library. In 1950, Miss Overton retired, and the library closed for 6 months to find a replacement. In 1953, Elizabeth Miller became the third librarian to take over the children's library. Miss Miller remained for 22 years, retiring in 1975. Janet Collins succeeded her working there until 1984. Since then, others have worked at the Children's Library, leaving their own marks and impressions on the children who fall in love with it, as did those children who first entered on June 24, 1924. Westbury African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Do you remember I mentioned at the beginning that there was a connection binding the Westbury monthly meeting of the Religious Society of Friends and Hicks Nursery to the Westbury AME Zion Church? Well, do you remember Isaac Hicks, who founded Hicks Nurseries? He's the link. In 1834, Isaac Hicks was a young fellow of only 19, and he was friends with Eliakim Levi, who at the time worked as a farmer for Isaac's mother, Sarah Hicks, on the Hicks family property north of Jericho Turnpike. 160 acres of that farm would later become the property of John S. Phipps, who, in 1906, built his estate, Westbury House, on the land. Today we know the Phipps estate as Old Westbury Gardens. But back in 1834, Eliakim lived on that land, and it was farmland, and he was a free man. He lived on that portion of the property near the corner of Jericho Turnpike and what is now known as Glen Cove Road. Isaac and Eliakim would have known it as Guinea Woods Road. The area where Eliakim lived and went to school and was taught to read and write by the Quakers was known as Guineatown. The origin of this name is disputed, There are theories that it is a reference to the guinea fowl, to the west coast of Africa, and to an obsolete form of English currency. Eliakim was not unusual in working for a Quaker. Although the Quakers had freed their slaves in 1776, in many instances the freed slaves and several generations of their descendants remained to work the farms of their former owners. Because their children were brought up in proximity to Quaker families, were educated in Quaker-run schools, and went to services with them, the descendants of the freed slaves were very familiar with Quaker beliefs and practices. In the 1830s, men and women who were former slaves or who were the descendants of former slaves desired self-determination. At that time, most African Americans were slaves and were not guaranteed the right to assemble. In the spirit of self-determination, in 1834, Isaac, who was a reverend in the Society of Friends, helped his friend Eliakim to form a church for the free African Americans. Together, they wrote the organizational papers and disciplines for the formation of a church patterned upon the practices of which they were both familiar, those of the Society of Friends. The new religious institution was called the New Light Baptist Church, and Eliakim became its first pastor. Reverend Levi, like the Quakers, was formal in his speech, using the these and thous of a Quaker, and he dressed plainly, also like a Quaker. The church was open to all freed men and women and reportedly gave sanctuary to runaway slaves. It was a meeting place for members to exchange ideas, not only about their faith, but about building and farming. The congregation of the New Light Baptist Church built its first church, a plain and simple frame structure on a clearing on Woodland Drive Road. Many free African Americans had moved from the farms north of Jericho Turnpike to an area of Westbury known as Grantsville, where they owned their own homes and farms. That area was bounded by what is now Union Avenue, School Street, Grand Boulevard, and the Long Island Railroad. Despite having moved, they continued to go north of Jericho Turnpike to worship. The women of the congregation conducted sewing bees and canned their food, and some of the men fought in the Civil War for the North. After the Civil War, the church wanted to expand its sphere of influence and to be closer to its congregation. With the help of Isaac Hicks, the New Light Baptist Church received property on Grand Street, closer to Grantsville, from Richard Powell. In 1867, the church was moved to 274 Grand Street, across from the farm that belonged to Reverend Levi and his family. The name of the church was changed to the Westbury AME Zion Church, as it has remained for 150 years. The church is the second oldest religious congregation in Westbury. Reverend Levi passed away on March 8, 1879. Throughout his life, he had been connected to the Hicks family, and the connection continued after his death. A grandson of Reverend Levi, Mr. Charles Levi, worked for the Hicks family for 50 years. Moreover, Isaac Hicks assumed Reverend Levi's work after his death, sharing it with the Reverend Peter Coster, who would walk from Wantagh to preach to the Westbury AME Zion Church congregation, while Reverend Coster walked long distances to the church. Mr. William Henry Jackson, who was the church's first organist, had a more encumbered trek. He had a far shorter distance to go from his home on School Street than Reverend Coster, but he would bring his organ with him from his home to the church for services. In 1884, Mr. Jackson presented a bell brought from Albany to the church. Unfortunately, only 3 years later, in 1887, there was a split among the congregation. Half left and started its own church, what is now known as the Bethel AME Church. In 1888, the congregation that remained in the Westbury AME Zion Church rebuilt the church and added a steeple. They then installed the bell Mr. Jackson had given to the congregation. About this time, an impressive preacher, the Reverend Pringle, came to the church. He was the influence behind the church becoming part of the Conference of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Throughout the years, the church has undergone its share of change. A parsonage was built in 1908 for the pastors. In 1911, the Reverend Duncan James took over as pastor, and during his tenure, the church enrollment grew as entire families became involved in church life. There were many clubs, including the Women's Home and Foreign Missionary Society, and social clubs like the Magnolia Club and the Silver Spray, a group for young people. The church held musicals and concerts and sponsored speakers. The church built the fence surrounding the property in the 1910s to protect the church and the cemetery. In 1918, an 8-year remodeling of the church commenced, and in 1921, the outside of the structure was changed to brick. Between 1953 and 1963, the church underwent more renovations. The seating capacity was increased to 300, and the church created new accommodations for the choir. By 1959, the turret was gone from the church, and the church was designated as a historical landmark in January 1994 by the village of Westbury. Since 2000, the Reverend Gregor Miles has been the pastor of the Westbury AME Zion Church. Today, there is a congregation of over 100 multi-generational members who worship regularly on Sunday mornings. The church offers Bible studies and conducts prayer meetings throughout the week. Under Reverend Miles' leadership, he has instituted improvements to both the interior and the exterior of the church and has implemented outreach projects in the community. The congregation hosts movie night and other recreational activities and conducts food drives and partners with other churches for community events such as the Kingdom Community Day. The members of the Village Historic Landmark Preservation Committee have not yet completed the Heritage Trail. In a village as old as Westbury, with as many important and interesting places, they are still hard at work deciding which places will be designated next. Why, as we near the end of the second decade of the 21st century, do we concentrate so much effort on places that were of importance hundreds of years earlier? Gary Monty, chairman of the committee, offered this explanation.
Sometimes you do things you don't realize the reason behind it. And I think a big part of this is that Westbury has really come into its own in the 21st century. And you can see that develop. You see it in Westbury. You can't miss it. All this is going on, and we're stepping into the future. So if you step into the future, start thinking about the past. Inadvertently, I think. And then maybe that's why. So if we're going to think about where Westbury should go, let's find out where it was. Simple as that.
cutest little baby face. There's not another one could take your place. Baby face, my poor heart is jumping. You should have started something, baby face. I'm up in heaven when I'm in your fond embrace. I didn't need a shout, 'cause I just fell in love with your pretty baby face. I didn't need a shout, 'cause I just fell. Yes, I guess I fell in love with your pretty baby. Love that pretty baby face. Here I am, honey. Come on, proud of me.
You know what you should have sent me about where is your business now?
Just to waste the time, baby, baby. You don't have to walk alone. If your lover won't walk with you, take my hand, won't you, honey? Come on and walk with me. Oh yeah, when you are waiting, I'm so in love. Leave me no more. Won't you come back home? Won't you come back home? Won't you come back home? Baby, come on home. Loneliness, loneliness, just to waste the time. Baby, you don't have to walk alone.